The recovery technician was a former Marine named Hollis Prager, and he had opened a lot of cockpits in his career. But he had never opened one like this. The plexiglass was gone, eaten by 40 monsoons. The instrument panel was a green smear of corrosion. But the pilot was still there. He was strapped in. His helmet was still on his head. The chin cup rotted through, the bone of his jaw resting against the inside of the visor. His gloved hands had fallen from the cyclic decades ago, and now lay in his lap like a man at prayer. The flight log was open on the dash, and on the page, in pencil that had survived 4 decades of wet and dry and wet again, were the words, "Passenger requesting unscheduled deviation to grid," and then nothing. The next page had been torn out. Prager leaned in further. He smelled wet rust and the old, sweet rot of jungle mud. And then he saw the second helmet. It was on the co-pilot seat, not thrown there, not flung loose by impact. Folded, placed. The chin strap had been tucked under the brim with the kind of care a man uses when he expects to come back for a thing. Prager keyed his radio and called for the team leader. He said, "You need to come look at this. We have a problem." To understand how they ended up there, a Vietnamese forestry crew, an American CID investigator, and a brass lighter sold in a Louisiana pawn shop, we need to go back 40 years to the autumn of 1969, to a resupply run codenamed Redwood Anchor, and to a man whose name the United States Army insisted had never existed. Wherever you are in the world, take a moment to share it in the comments. It really matters to us to know who's listening and where from. Every subscription helps bring new stories to life. The forestry foreman, a man named Win Van Lapp, stopped his crew because the bulldozer blade had struck something that rang. It was the wrong kind of ring. Stone sang dull. Roots thudded. This was a high, hollow note, the note of cold metal in cold water, and Lapp had heard it before, in 1972, when his uncle's sampan had snagged on the wing of a downed phantom in the Qua Viet River. He climbed down off the dozer and waded into the tributary, and what he found, half buried in red laterite silt, was the tail boom of an American helicopter, the painted serial corroded to ghost marks, the green of the original olive drab still faintly visible where the silt had protected it from 40 seasons of sun. Lapp was 46 years old. He had been 5 when this aircraft fell. He sent a runner back to the village and told his crew to stop work and wait, and he sat on the bank and smoked a Vinataba cigarette and watched the water move slowly past the dead machine. 6 weeks later, a joint recovery team arrived. The American lead was Glenn Hargrove, a retired Army Criminal Investigation Division warrant officer, 58 years old, gray at the temples, with the kind of slow, patient face that does not give a man's thinking away. He had been doing MIA recovery work for the Defense POW/MIA accounting agency for 9 years. He had brought home pieces of 17 aircraft. He thought he had seen the shape of every story the jungle could tell. The aircraft was a UH-1D Huey, a slick, the workhorse of the war, and the partial tail number Hargrove's team pulled from the boom matched a record in the St. Louis archive. Tail number 66-417, attached to a fictional company of the 1st Cavalry Division, lost in the late monsoon of 1969 on a resupply run codenamed Redwood Anchor. The pilot of record was Warrant Officer Dale Murchison, 24 years old, of Beaumont, Texas. The manifest listed no co-pilot, no crew chief, no door gunner, a solo flight. Unusual but not unheard of for a short courier hop. The team worked for 9 days in heat that came up off the laterite in visible waves. They drained a section of the tributary with a portable pump that ran on diesel and coughed black smoke into the canopy. The smell of warm mud and JP4 residue, baked into the soil for 40 years, came up out of the ground every time a shovel went in, and the older Americans on the team breathed it and said nothing, because that smell took them places they did not want to go. On the 10th day, Hollis Prager pried the cockpit open and found Warrant Officer Murchison still strapped in. Hargrove came down the bank and stood at the edge of the wreck and looked. He had seen pilots in cockpits before. He had not seen one this complete. The straps had held. The harness had held. The man had gone down with his aircraft and stayed with it, and the river had risen and fallen around him for 40 years and left him exactly where he had sat down. It was the second helmet that stopped Hargrove. Prager pointed without touching. The helmet on the co-pilot seat was an APH-5, the same standard-issue flight helmet Murchison wore, but it had not been thrown there in the crash. It had been folded and placed. The name tape on the brow was legible under a careful brushing of the silt. Hargrove leaned in close and read it in the dim, wet light of the cockpit, and he felt the small, cold thing at the back of his neck that he had felt only twice before in his career, both times in cases that did not end well. The name on the second helmet was Thibodaux. Hargrove straightened up and looked at the manifest in his hand. There was no Thibodaux on the manifest. There was no Thibodaux in the squadron book. There was no Thibodaux in the casualty list, the missing list, the morning report, the pay roster, or any document the United States Army had produced in the autumn of 1969. He had checked all of them on the flight from Honolulu because he was the kind of man who checked. He climbed back up the bank and sat down on a fallen teak log and lit a cigarette he was not supposed to be smoking, and he thought about the way the second helmet had been placed. A man who is about to die in a crashing helicopter does not fold his helmet and set it on the seat beside him. A man does that when he is getting out. Linnea Murchison was 64 years old, and she had buried an empty coffin in 1970, and she had not remarried, and she lived in the same small frame house on Calder Avenue in Beaumont where she and Dale had spent the 4 months they had together as husband and wife. She made Hargrove iced tea. The window unit in the living room hummed and dripped into a dish towel she had laid on the sill, and the smell of the house was lemon furniture polish and old paperback books and the faint sweet must of a Gulf Coast summer that never entirely leaves the wood. She kept everything in a cedar chest at the foot of her bed. She brought the chest out into the living room and she opened it, and she laid the contents out on the coffee table one piece at a time, the way a museum docent lays out an exhibit she has rehearsed for 40 years. The telegram, the folded flag, triangle creased, the cotton gone the color of weak tea, a bundle of letters tied with brown grocery string, a black and white photograph of a young man in a flight suit standing beside a Huey on a PSP pad, squinting into the sun, smiling at whoever held the camera. Hargrove asked her to tell him about the lighter. Her face changed. It did not soften. It tightened, the way a face tightens around a thing that has been waiting a long time to be asked about. She had bought it for him in the spring of 1968 at a jeweler on Proctor Street, 2 blocks from the courthouse where they had been married. She had paid $11.50, which was a great deal of money for a young schoolteacher in Beaumont. She had asked the jeweler to engrave it on the front, and she had told him exactly what to put. D. Murchison, keep the blue side up, 68. The blue side up was a flying expression Dale had taught her. Sky on top, ground on the bottom. Don't get those mixed up. She had given it to him on the night before he shipped out. He had laughed and put it in the chest pocket of his fatigue jacket and patted the pocket and said, "This is going home with me, baby, on the same airplane I do." It had not come home. The personal effects the Army had returned to her in 1970 contained his wallet, his watch, his St. Christopher medal, and 3 letters she had written him that he had not yet had a chance to send back to her. The lighter was not in the box. She had assumed it had burned in the crash or sunk in the river, or been taken by a soldier on the other side as a battlefield trophy, the way such things sometimes were. She had not seen it in 39 years. Hargrove drank his iced tea and listened. He did not tell her yet that the thing she had engraved on Proctor Street in 1968 had been logged into a pawnshop ledger in Bossier City, Louisiana, 3 months after her husband's helicopter went into a river in Quang Tri Province. He did not tell her that the man who had pawned it had signed her husband's name to the slip. He did not tell her any of it, because he was not yet sure what story those facts told, and Linnea Murchison had been telling herself a story for 40 years, and he was not going to take her story away from her until he had something better to put in its place. He flew back to Virginia that night. He took with him the cedar chest's inventory list, written in her schoolteacher's careful hand, and he took with him the photograph of Dale by the Huey on the PSP pad, and he took with him a small ache in the chest he had not expected. In his own house in Falls Church, in a basement his late father had used as a workshop, there was a steamer trunk Hargrove had been meaning to go through for 6 years. His father, Master Sergeant Royce Hargrove, had served 3 tours in Vietnam, the last of them as a personnel clerk at MACV headquarters in Saigon in 1969 and 70. He had died of pancreatic cancer in 2002, and the trunk had been in the basement ever since, and Hargrove had never quite been able to make himself open it. He opened it that night. He told himself he was looking for context. He was looking for the texture of his father's war, the names of his father's friends, the smell of the place his father had carried home in his clothes and never quite gotten out of them. What he found near the bottom, in a manila folder labeled in his father's small block printing, Transfers, Q369, was a personnel transfer slip. It was a carbon, the 3rd carbon by the look of it, the ink faint and blue. The date was redacted. The originating unit was redacted. The receiving unit was redacted. The name of the soldier being transferred had been blacked out with a felt tip marker, but the marker had been applied unevenly, and in one spot the ink had not fully covered the typewriter strike, and Hargrove tilted the page to the lamp and read what was underneath. The first letter was a T. The junior investigator on Hargrove's team was a woman named Audra Beck, 29 years old, 2 years out of the FBI Academy on a 1-year detail to the accounting agency. She did not know Vietnam. She knew databases. She had spent the morning running the brass Zippo's serial number stamped into the bottom of the case in 1966 at the Bradford, Pennsylvania factory against a national clearinghouse of pawnshop ledger digitizations that the Bureau had built in the late 1990s. It was a long shot. She did it anyway because Hargrove had asked her to, and because she was the kind of woman who finished a thing once she started it. The hit came back at 4:17 in the afternoon. She read it twice. Then she got up from her desk and walked down the hall to Hargrove's office, and she stood in the doorway and she said, "Sir, I think you need to see this." The hit was a pawn shop on Barksdale Boulevard in Bossier City, Louisiana, 2 miles from the gate of Barksdale Air Force Base. The shop had closed in 1984, but its ledgers had been preserved as part of a state historical project documenting the economic life of military communities along the Red River. The Zippo had been pawned in the autumn of 1969, 3 months after the crash. The customer had paid $4 cash in exchange and walked out. The lighter had never been redeemed. The shop had eventually sold it as unclaimed inventory in 1971. The signature on the pawn slip was D. Murchison. Hargrove sat with that for a long minute. He had expected, he realized, something else. He had expected a thief, a souvenir hunter, a sergeant who had taken the lighter off a body and brought it home and then needed beer money. He had not expected the dead man's signature. He asked Beck to pull a sample of Murchison's actual handwriting from the cedar chest inventory Linnea had photocopied for him. The 2 signatures were on his desk side by side in 20 minutes. They were not the same hand. Murchison's D was a careful, round D, schoolboy precise, with a small loop. The pawn slip D was angular, slashed, written by a man in a hurry, or a man for whom the name was a costume he had not yet learned to wear. Hargrove stood at the window of his office and looked out at the parking lot. He had been doing this work for 9 years. He had been a CID investigator for 20 before that. He understood the shape of what he was looking at. A man had walked out of a helicopter crash in Quang Tri Province in the late monsoon of 1969. He had walked, or been carried, or been flown, somehow back to the United States, to a town 2 miles from a strategic bomber base. He had carried with him a brass lighter engraved with a dead man's name. He had pawned it for $4. He had signed the dead man's name to the slip. The working theory of Operation Redwood Anchor, that Warrant Officer Dale Murchison had flown a routine resupply alone, suffered a mechanical failure or hostile fire, and gone into the river with his aircraft, was wrong. It had been wrong for 40 years. There had been a second man. The second man had survived. And someone, somewhere in the long chain of clerks and officers and signatures that produces an after-action review, had decided that the second man would not exist. Hargrove thought about his father's transfer slip in the basement trunk in Falls Church, with the felt-tip marker and the T showing through. He did not yet let himself follow that thought to where it wanted to go. He turned to Beck and he said, "Book me a flight to Shreveport. I want to read that ledger with my own eyes." Beck nodded. She went back to her desk. She did not see, because Hargrove did not let her see, the small unsteadiness in his hand as he picked up the photograph of Dale Murchison standing on the PSP pad in Quang Tri in 1969, smiling at whoever held the camera. Whoever had held the camera, Hargrove now understood, had been a man the United States Army did not admit existed. The after-action review for Operation Redwood Anchor was 4 pages long. Hargrove had requested the file from the National Archives at College Park 6 weeks earlier, and it had arrived at his office in a manila folder so thin he had thought, when Beck handed it to him, that there must be more pages somewhere else. There were not more pages. 4 pages was the entire institutional memory of a mission on which an aircraft and a man had been lost. He read the review 3 times. The first time for content, the second time for omissions, the third time for the texture of the prose, which was, in his long experience, where a clerk's discomfort tended to live. The mission was logged as a routine resupply, ammunition, sea rations, and mail to a fictional fire support base near the demilitarized zone. Departure from Camp Evans at 0640 hours. Estimated time on station, 20 minutes. Estimated return, 0915. Aircraft failed to return. Search and rescue dispatched at 10:30. No wreckage located. Pilot listed as missing in action, body not recovered. The file was closed in March of 1970. The prose was clean. Too clean. Hargrove had read hundreds of after-action reviews from 1969, and they were almost never this clean. They had crossings out. They had pencil marginalia. They had the small human residue of men writing fast in a war. This one had been retyped. He could feel it. He sent Beck to the Quartermaster Archives to pull the fuel consumption logs for Camp Evans for the week of the loss. She came back the next morning with a single Xerox. The Huey, tail number 66-417, had been refueled to capacity at 0620 hours on the morning of the mission. Standard JP4 fill, 210 gallons. The aircraft had not returned, and so it had not been refueled again. The next aircraft to use that pad had been a different Huey 3 hours later, and the fuel issued to that aircraft was logged separately. Beck had highlighted a number with a yellow marker. The fuel issued to 66-417 that morning was 11% more than a standard solo resupply hop to the fire support base would have burned, even with reserve. The number was consistent with a heavier-than-manifested aircraft or a longer-than-planned route, or both. Hargrove looked at the number for a long time. He thought about how a quartermaster sergeant in 1969, filling out a fuel log at 0620 in the morning, would not know and would not care what story the official record was going to tell about this aircraft 3 months later. He would only fill in the actual gallons that had gone into the actual tank. And 40 years later, that small piece of indifferent paperwork would sit in a box in a quartermaster archive and quietly contradict an after-action review that had been retyped to be clean. He closed the folder. He went home that night, and he went down to the basement, and he opened his father's steamer trunk again. He sat on the concrete floor with his back against the workbench his father had built in 1973, and he went through the trunk piece by piece in a way he had not done the first time. He found, near the bottom, beneath a stack of MACV personnel rosters, a small drawstring bag of green canvas. Inside the bag was an unopened pack of Vietnamese cigarettes, the brand his father had smoked over there, Bastos Blue, the paper now brittle and yellow. The bag smelled, faintly after 40 years, of the cigarettes and of his father's sweat, and of something else, the green, wet smell of a country Hargrove had never been to, and now would, in some way he could not name, never quite leave. He held the bag for a long time. He thought about his father's hands. He thought about the felt-tip marker on the transfer slip, and the unevenness of the application, and the T showing through. He put the bag back in the trunk. He went upstairs, and he booked a flight for the next morning, and he packed a small bag, because he had decided that he was going to drive the rest of the way. He wanted the time. He wanted the road. He wanted the 400 miles between Vicksburg and Shreveport to think about whether he was investigating his father and what he was going to do if the answer turned out to be yes. He flew into Jackson, Mississippi, and rented a car at the airport and drove west. The interstate was empty in the early afternoon. He passed pine plantations and kudzu and the small crumbling farmhouses of the Delta, and he listened to a sports radio station out of Jackson until it faded, and then he listened to a country station out of Monroe until that faded, and then he drove in silence for a long time. He stopped in Vicksburg for the night because he did not want to arrive in Shreveport tired. He stayed at a motel near the river, 2 stories of cinder block painted yellow, a window unit that dripped onto the carpet, a vending machine in the breezeway that hummed all night. The smell of the room was old cigarette smoke and pine cleaner. He lay on the bed in his clothes and watched the ceiling fan turn, and he thought about his father. His father had not talked about Vietnam. Not the first tour, not the second, not the third. He had been a clerk, he said. He had typed forms. He had not seen combat. He had come home and gotten a job at the post office in Falls Church and raised 3 children and gone bowling on Thursday nights and died of cancer at 71 years old. And the war had been, for as long as Hargrove had known him, a closed door at the back of his father's house that the family had silently agreed not to open. Hargrove had wondered sometimes what was behind the door. He had assumed it was the ordinary thing, the small private griefs and small private compromises that any man brings home from a war. He had not assumed it was a transfer slip with a man's name blacked out on it. He drove on to Shreveport in the morning. The State Historical Society was housed in a former bank building on Texas Street. Marble columns, a brass-railed staircase, the smell of old paper and floor wax. The pawnshop ledgers were in a climate-controlled room in the basement. A young archivist, a man named Reuben Aldama, brought Hargrove the volume he had asked for and laid it on a reading table and put on cotton gloves and turned the pages for him. The entry was on page 187. The pawnbroker had written in pencil, in a small, careful hand. Date. Item description. Zippo LTR, brass, anger. Engraving, D. Murchison, keep blue side up, 68. Loan amount, $4. Customer signature, D. Murchison, in that angular slashed hand. And in the margin, in the same pencil, in the pawnbroker's private shorthand, the note Hargrove had come 400 miles to read. Cajun, limp on the left side, paid cash, did not haggle. Hargrove copied the entry into his notebook with his own pencil. He copied the marginal note word for word. He sat at the reading table for a long time after he had finished copying, looking at the pawnbroker's handwriting, thinking about a man with a Cajun accent and a limp on the left side who had walked into a shop on Barksdale Boulevard in the autumn of 1969 and pawned a dead man's lighter for $4. His phone rang. He had forgotten to silence it. The archivist looked up disapprovingly. Hargrove apologized and stepped into the hallway. The caller was a woman named Patricia Weems. She was 61 years old. She lived in Tacoma, Washington. Her father, Dr. Curtis Weems, had been a flight surgeon with the 1st Cavalry Division in 1969. He was 84 years old. He was in a hospice at the Tacoma VA. He had a few weeks, maybe a few days. He had asked her to find a man named Hargrove who was investigating the loss of a Huey near the DMZ in the late monsoon of '69. Her father, she said, had something he wanted to say before he went, and he had been carrying it around since before she was born, and he was not going to be able to die quiet until he said it to somebody official. Hargrove asked her how her father had known he was looking. She said, "My father has been waiting for somebody to come ask, for 40 years. He told me when I was 12 years old that someday a man would call about a helicopter, and when that man called, I should call him." Hargrove drove back to the airport that afternoon. He flew to Seattle that night. The hospice ward at the Tacoma VA was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of disinfectant and overcooked vegetables and the faint, sweet decay of bodies that were not going to recover. Hargrove signed in at the desk. A nurse walked him down a long linoleum corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere on the ward, a television was playing a daytime talk show at low volume. Curtis Weems was in a private room at the end of the hall. He was a small man, made smaller by the bed, his white hair combed back, his hands resting on the blanket like two pale animals that had given up. There was an oxygen cannula in his nose and a clear plastic tube taped to the back of his hand. He was lucid in fragments. His daughter Patricia sat in a vinyl chair by the window, knitting something that did not appear to have a shape yet. Hargrove pulled up a chair and sat down beside the bed and introduced himself. He spoke slowly. He said he was a retired CID investigator. He said he was looking into the loss of a Huey in Quang Tri Province in the autumn of 1969. He said he understood Dr. Weems had something he wanted to share. Curtis Weems opened his eyes. He spoke in a voice that was almost a whisper, and Hargrove had to lean in close, and the smell of the old man's breath was the smell of a body shutting down, sweet and metallic and final. Weems said, "I signed 2 flight physicals that morning." Hargrove waited. Weems said, "The first one was Murchison. Murchison was healthy. He had a head cold, but he was cleared to fly. I gave him a packet of decongestants, and I told him to drink water. The second one was a civilian. The civilian was about 40 years old. He was lean. He had a limp on the left side, an old wound. He said it was an old hunting accident from when he was a boy. I cleared him to fly. He did not give me a service number. He gave me a name. The name was Thibodaux, Roy Thibodaux. He was Cajun, from down by Homa, he said. He did not show me orders. He showed me a card with a phone number on it, and he said if I had any questions, I should call the number. I did not call the number. I signed his physical. I put both physicals in the squadron book that morning at 0600. Weems stopped. He breathed for a long time. The cannula hissed. He said, at 0830, after the aircraft had not returned, a major came into the dispensary. I had never seen him before. He was not in my chain of command. He was not wearing a unit patch. He took the squadron book off my desk, and he opened it, and he removed the second physical. He took it out into the parking lot. I followed him because I did not understand what was happening. He had a coffee can. He had lighter fluid. He burned the physical in the coffee can in the parking lot of the dispensary at 0845 in the morning. I watched him do it. He looked at me when he was done, and he said, "Doctor, you signed 1 physical this morning. 1. And I understood what he was telling me. Weems closed his eyes. He said, "I have been a doctor for 57 years. I took an oath. I have not broken that oath but once in my life. I broke it in a parking lot in 1969, in front of a major whose name I never learned, and a man named Roy Thibodaux walked into a helicopter that morning and into nothing. And I have carried him in my chest for 40 years like a stone. And I am dying now, and I would like very much to put the stone down." Hargrove sat with him for a long time. He held the old man's hand. Patricia kept knitting. The fluorescent lights buzzed. After a while, Curtis Weems was asleep, and Hargrove rose quietly and walked out into the corridor, and he stood by a window that looked out over a parking lot in the rain, and he understood that the cover-up he was looking at was not a clerical error. The cover-up was operational. It had been planned in advance. Someone in MACV in the autumn of 1969 had put a civilian named Roy Thibodaux on a slick to a fire support base near the DMZ, and someone in MACV had decided, before the aircraft had even taken off, that if anything went wrong, the civilian had never been on board. Hargrove flew back to Virginia the next morning. On the plane, he closed his eyes and he saw, very clearly, the name that had been blacked out on his father's transfer slip. He saw the T showing through. He saw the felt-tip marker applied unevenly by a man who had been in a hurry, or by a man who had not particularly wanted the name to be entirely gone. The Freedom of Information Act request had been filed 3 years earlier by a researcher Hargrove had never met, on behalf of a family the agency had never identified. It had wound its way through the system the way such requests do, sitting in queues, being referred from one office to another, gathering stamps and routing slips, until it had finally produced a single declassified document, which had been mailed to the requester at an address in Lake Charles, Louisiana, in the summer of 2007. The requester had forwarded the document to the accounting agency 6 months later with a short cover letter that said only, "I believe this concerns one of your missing." The letter was unsigned. The agency had filed it. Audra Beck found it during a routine cross-reference search after Hargrove returned from Tacoma. The document was a single black-and-white photograph, 8 inches by 10, with a date stamp on the back that read, in faded purple ink, July 1970. The photograph showed 3 men at a desk in what appeared to be a Saigon safe house. The room was small. The walls were painted institutional green. There was a ceiling fan. There was a bottle of whiskey on the desk and 3 glasses. The men were in civilian clothes, short-sleeved white shirts, no insignia, no name tapes. 2 of the men had their faces partially turned away from the camera. One man was looking directly at the lens. He was lean. He was about 40 years old. His left leg was extended awkwardly under the desk in a way that suggested an old injury he was trying to keep comfortable. His hair was dark and combed back. His eyes were quiet and intelligent. On the desk, beside the whiskey bottle, in clear focus, sat a brass Zippo lighter. Hargrove brought the photograph to a forensic imaging specialist at the FBI lab in Quantico, an old colleague named Dennis Chow. Chow spent 2 days with the negative. He produced an enlargement of the lighter that filled an entire 11 by 17 sheet. The engraving on the front was not entirely legible, but enough of it could be read to confirm what Hargrove already knew. D. Murchison. Keep the blue side up. 68. The photograph had been taken nearly a year after the crash. Hargrove asked the agency's CIA liaison to identify the man looking at the camera. The liaison's response, 3 weeks later, was a single sentence on agency letterhead. "We are unable to confirm or deny the identity of any individuals depicted in the referenced image." Hargrove was not surprised. He had not expected confirmation. He had expected the silence, which was, in its own way, a kind of confirmation. The silence said, "This man worked for us, and we are not going to admit it, and we are not going to deny it, and you may draw whatever conclusion you wish." He flew home to Virginia. He checked into a hotel in Arlington because he did not want to go back to his house yet. He needed a night with the lights of a city outside the window and the white noise of a hotel ventilation system, and no basement, and no trunk, and no felt tip marker showing a T through the ink. He fell asleep at 11. He dreamed of the river in Quang Tri Province, although he had never been there. He dreamed of a man with a limp walking out of the water in the late monsoon, carrying a brass lighter in his hand. At 2 o'clock in the morning, somebody knocked on the door. Hargrove sat up. He did not turn on the light. He was a man who had spent 32 years in law enforcement, and he did not open hotel doors at 2 in the morning without first looking through the peephole. Through the peephole, he saw an elderly woman, perhaps 70 years old, white-haired, in a beige raincoat, standing very still in the corridor. She was alone. She was not looking at the door. She was looking at the carpet with the patient, self-contained stillness of a person who has rehearsed this moment many times. He opened the door. She looked up. She said, "Mr. Hargrove, my name is Marielle Thibodaux Boudreau. My father was Roy Thibodaux. I have been waiting 40 years to meet someone who was looking for him. May I please come in?" She sat in the desk chair by the window. He sat on the edge of the bed. The hotel room was dim, only the bathroom light on, the door cracked open. The traffic on the highway below made a soft, continuous sound like distant water. Marielle was 71 years old. She had been 32 when her father had disappeared. She had a master's degree in library science from LSU, which she had used for her entire working life as the head archivist at a parish historical society in Lake Charles, and she had spent 40 years, in her professional capacity and her private one, slowly and patiently looking for her father in the documentary record of the United States government. She had found things. She had found, in the early 1980s, a flight manifest in a box of declassified MACV paperwork at College Park, on which her father's name had been typed and then erased, with the eraser leaving a slight roughness in the paper that was visible only when the page was tilted to the light. She had found, in the 1990s, a CIA pay voucher with a control number that matched a personnel file the agency would not produce. She had found, 2 years ago, the photograph from the Saigon safe house in a routine FOIA dump from the Office of the Inspector General, and she had recognized her father's face, and she had recognized the lighter on the desk, although she had never seen the lighter in her life, because her father had described it to her once, in a letter from Saigon in the autumn of 1970, as the thing he was carrying that he was not supposed to have, that he meant for someone, someday, to find. She had brought a document with her. She took it out of her handbag, and she laid it on the hotel desk under the lamp. It was a photocopy of a personnel order, MACV letterhead, autumn of 1969. The order directed the immediate scrubbing of all references to a named individual from the personnel records of the Joint Command, the deployment manifests of the 1st Cavalry Division, and the pay rosters of the Defense Finance and Accounting Service. The named individual was Roy Thibodaux. Hargrove looked at the order. The order was signed by a master sergeant. The master sergeant's name was Royce Hargrove. Hargrove looked at it for a long time. He felt very distinctly the small, cold thing at the back of his neck. Marielle sat in the desk chair and watched him. She did not say anything. She had been an archivist for 40 years. She knew when a document was doing its work. Hargrove said at last, "This is my father's signature." Marielle nodded. She said, "I know. I have known for 2 years. I obtained your service file when you were appointed to lead the recovery team. I am very sorry, Mr. Hargrove. I did not know how to tell you. I did not know whether you would want to know. I came tonight because I decided that you deserved the truth before the agency seals the report, and I did not know whether you would still be looking after that." Hargrove sat with the document in his hands. He thought about his father at the kitchen table in Falls Church in 1975, helping him with his algebra homework, the smell of coffee and old cigarettes on his father's shirt. He thought about his father in the basement workshop in 1980, building the workbench. He thought about his father in the hospice in 2002, 90 pounds, the morphine drip, holding his son's hand and saying, "Glenn, there are some things I never told your mother," and then closing his eyes and not opening them again. He had thought at the time that his father had meant the small things. The drinking in the early years, the girlfriend in Saigon perhaps, the ordinary residue of a young man's war. He had not thought it was a transfer slip. He asked Marielle what she knew about her father after the crash. She said, "He came home. He did not come home to us. He came home under another name. He lived for 18 years under that name. He lived in Galveston, Texas, where he worked as a longshoreman, and he sent my mother money every month in cash, in unmarked envelopes postmarked from various places along the Gulf Coast. And he never came to see her because he had been told that if he made contact with his family would be unsafe. He died of a heart attack in 1987 in a rooming house in Galveston at the age of 58. The man who buried him was a friend from his longshoreman crew who knew him only as Andre Boudreau. I learned all of this in 1994 when the friend, dying himself, sent me a letter and a small box of my father's things. The box contained a St. Christopher medal that my mother had given my father in 1943, and a photograph of me at age 6, and a key to a post office box in Galveston that had been closed for 7 years. She paused. She said, "I never met him as an adult. I have spent 40 years looking for a man I last saw when I was 32 years old, who walked out of our house in Lake Charles in 1969 to fly to Saigon for a contract job he could not describe, and who never came back, and who was, I now know, alive for 18 years after we buried him in our hearts." Hargrove put the document down on the desk. He said, "The lighter." Marielle nodded. She said, "The lighter was his signal. He took it from Murchison after the crash. He told my mother, in a letter from Saigon a year later, that he had taken something from the man who had died with him, and that he was carrying it, and that someday someone would find it, and when they did, the truth would come with it. He did not say what the thing was. My mother did not understand. She thought he was speaking metaphorically. He was not. She looked at Hargrove. She said, "Mr. Hargrove, I would very much like to see that lighter." The recovery laboratory of the Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency was on Joint Base Pearl Harbor-Hickam in Honolulu. The flight log from 66-417 had been there for 4 months. It had been stabilized in a controlled humidity chamber. It had been photographed under raking light. It had been digitized. The legible portions of the text had been transcribed by 2 independent analysts, and the transcriptions had been compared. Hargrove went to see it himself. The lab technician was a woman named Sue Min Park, 52 years old, 23 years with the agency, the steadiest pair of hands in the building. She laid the log out on a stainless steel table under a fluorescent magnifier. The pages were the color of weak tea. The pencil writing was faint but legible where it survived. Murchison's hand was the same careful round hand Hargrove had seen on the inventory list in Linnea's cedar chest. The entries were terse, professional. Time, location in grid coordinates, fuel state, weather. The last entry, the one Hargrove had been thinking about for 9 weeks, read in full, 0837, passenger requesting unscheduled deviation to grid, and then nothing. The next page had been torn out. The torn edge was clean. The tear had been made along a fold, with deliberate pressure. Park had spent 2 months looking for the missing fragment in the wreckage. She had not found it. The tear, she told Hargrove, had not been made in the crash. The tear had been made by a man who knew exactly how to remove a page from a flight log so that it would not be reconstructible. Hargrove asked her about the cyclic grip. Park nodded. She had been waiting for him to ask. She brought out a separate evidence box and opened it under the magnifier. The cyclic grip was a black rubber sleeve, cracked but intact, that had been removed from the cockpit and stabilized. Under the magnifier, in raking light, 2 distinct sets of latent fingerprint residue were visible, baked into the rubber by 40 years of heat and humidity. One set matched a sample of Murchison's prints that the Army had on file from his enlistment in 1966. The other set matched no military or law enforcement file in any database the agency had access to. Hargrove stood at the table for a long time and looked at the second set of prints. He thought about a man with a limp on the left side, a Cajun accent, an old hunting wound. He thought about a man who had taken the controls of a Huey in the late monsoon of 1969 after the pilot had gone unconscious or been hit or simply been overwhelmed, and who had fought the aircraft into a tributary of the Song Ben Hai with skill enough to walk away from the wreckage. He thought about the second helmet, folded and placed on the co-pilot seat. He understood finally what the placement meant. Roy Thibodaux had taken the helmet off. He had folded it. He had set it on the seat. He had done this because he was about to disappear, and he had wanted to leave behind the evidence that he had been there. He had wanted somebody, someday, to find the helmet, and to ask the question, and to keep asking until the question was answered. It had taken 40 years, but the helmet had done its work. Hargrove flew home that night. He did not call his mother. His mother was 83 years old and lived in a retirement community in Charlottesville, and she had been married to Royce Hargrove for 46 years, and she had loved him, and she did not need to know, at her age, what her husband had signed in a personnel office in Saigon in the autumn of 1969. That was a decision Hargrove made on the drive from Dulles to Falls Church, alone in the car, with the radio off, the lights of the highway going past. He was not sure whether it was the right decision. He thought he might think about it for the rest of his life. He went home. He sat in the kitchen with the lights off. He poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon, and he did not drink it. He sat with the glass in his hand until almost dawn. He met Marielle at a diner on Ryan Street in Lake Charles in the late winter of 2009. The diner was the kind of place she had eaten breakfast in every Saturday of her childhood. The booth was vinyl. The coffee was thin. A ceiling fan turned slowly above their heads, and the smell of bacon and chicory came from the kitchen. Outside the window, the Louisiana sun was low and white over the parking lot. He had brought the lighter in a small padded envelope. The agency had released it to him from the evidence box once the recovery report had been finalized and the Murchison family had formally declined to claim it. Linnea had said on the phone that the lighter belonged to whoever the second man was. She had said that her husband had been buried with full honors at Arlington, and that she had at last been able to lower a coffin into the ground that was not empty, and that was enough for her, and the rest of the story belonged to other people. Hargrove laid the envelope on the formica table between them. Marielle did not open it for a long time. She drank her coffee. She looked out the window at the parking lot. Then she opened the envelope, and she took the lighter out, and she held it in her hand. It was warm from the envelope. It was scratched. The brass was dark with the patina of 40 years and a journey across an ocean and a pawn shop and a Saigon safe house and a rooming house in Galveston and a longshoreman's pocket and an evidence box at Pearl Harbor. She turned it over. On the back of the case, in tiny scratched letters, almost invisible, scratched with the point of a knife or a nail by a man working in poor light and in a hurry, were 2 letters and 2 words. R.T. Still up. Marielle looked at the engraving for a long time. Hargrove watched her. He did not speak. She said, finally, "My father was an instrument-rated pilot. He flew commercially in Louisiana before the war." The expression, "keep the blue side up," was something he and Murchison would have understood the same way. It means, don't crash. It means, stay alive. He took the lighter. He scratched his initials on the back. He put "still up" because he was telling whoever found it that he had not crashed. He had stayed alive. She closed her hand around the lighter. She said, "He wanted me to know. He wanted somebody to know. He could not come home. He could not write. But he could carry a lighter, and he could scratch 2 words on the back of it, and he could trust that someday the world would be the kind of world where a thing like that could be found." Hargrove paid the check. They walked out into the parking lot. The afternoon was warm. A truck went past on Ryan Street with the windows down and a country song playing. The recovery report was sealed by the agency 3 weeks later, on the recommendation of the CIA liaison and with the concurrence of the Department of Defense. The official cause of loss for 66-417 was listed as mechanical failure, pilot error suspected. Warrant Officer Dale Murchison was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery in a section reserved for the recovered missing. Linnea Murchison received a folded flag for the 2nd time in her life. She kept it in the cedar chest with the first one. The 2nd helmet was logged in the agency's evidence inventory as unidentified materiel, Quang Tri Province Recovery, 2008. And was placed in long-term storage in a climate-controlled facility outside Honolulu, where it remains. Roy Thibodaux' name has not been added to any official roster, manifest, or memorial. The CIA has not confirmed or denied his employment. The personnel order that erased him from the records, signed in the autumn of 1969 by Master Sergeant Royce Hargrove of MACV, is not part of the public file. Glenn Hargrove placed his copy in a sealed envelope in his safe deposit box at a bank in Falls Church, where it is to remain until after the death of his mother, at which point it will be transferred, by the terms of his will, to the Parish Historical Society in Lake Charles, Louisiana, in the care of Marielle Thibodaux Boudreau or her designated successor. Hargrove never learned who the major was who burned the 2nd flight physical in the dispensary parking lot at Camp Evans on the morning of the loss. He never learned who tore the page out of the flight log, or when, or where the page had been kept for 40 years, or whether it still existed somewhere in a file or a safe or a private collection. He never asked his mother about his father. He did not believe she knew. He chose to let her not know. The torn page was never found. In the spring of 2010, on the first warm afternoon of the year, Glenn Hargrove drove out to Arlington and stood at Dale Murchison's grave for a few minutes. He did not say anything. He had not brought flowers. He had brought, in his coat pocket, a small slip of paper on which he had written, in his own handwriting, the name Roy Thibodaux. He folded the slip and pressed it down into the soft grass at the base of the headstone, where the rain would take it. Then he drove home.